when we put the carburetors back. We have to put the carburetors into these little openings here and then tighten the clamps up. It's the oil injector cable. This has to be put on the carburetors in the right position and the nut tightened down. We have to attach the throttle cable onto the carburetor. We have two harnesses we need to connect wires onto. That comes off this harness that's on the carburetor. We have hoses, these hoses right here, and there's another one over here. We need to connect it back onto the carburetor. So one of the first things I do is take off the covers from the engine. Use a rag to clean the insides of the engine entry points. It'd be a good idea to actually wipe this off too. And then I got to put the carburetor in place. Make sure that it's oriented correctly. I'm going to be pushing this right into the engine. It looks like it's in there. I have to tighten up these screws for the clamp. So there's a cable that comes out the front of the carburetors. That's these two cables. One's a black and yellow cable and the other one's black. There's, on the main harness, there are two wires that come out. One's a yellow and black wire and one's a brown wire. The brown wire gets connected to the black right here. And then the yellow and black gets connected to each other. So I'm going to have to bring this cable into a little slot here and then bring it up through here like that. And then I have to pull this up and make sure it gets pulled into here and then screw this down. I think we're ready to put the air filter box in, but before I do that, I need to explain a few things. When the handlebar turns, you can see this shaft actually turning when I turn the handlebars. So every time you're riding, this is going to be turning around the air filter box, and this particular shaft is going to be spinning at very high speed. So you want to make sure none of the hoses touch it. You don't want anything touching the shaft or getting close to it, because anything that touches the shaft is going to wear down and leak, especially fuel lines or oil lines, and you'll have a dead engine. Or you could kill the engine if you rub through the fuel lines. If you rub through a harness, you're going to end up killing the snowmobile from running. So make sure that everything clears this. When you put the air filter housing in, keep that in mind. This is a fast moving shaft. And this one moves with when you change the steering, like you see here. So I did attach the other two lines, but I have to mention something that's very, very important. All three hoses going to the carburetors need to be under this hose, which is for the oil pump. You need to be under that. So all three need to be right next to each other, you see, and it has to be a smooth turn, so there are no kinks in the hose. That's the thing you got to make sure you do. The other thing I got to point out is when you put the clamps in place, make sure the clamp is not touching the other hose. Over time, the vibration will cut a hole in the hose. You want to turn the clamps away from the other hoses, and that's what I did here. If you don't, you're going to have loss of fuel. Okay, a lesson to learn from my first mistake. You don't tighten the clamps before you put the oil injector cable back. I'm going to show you exactly where. You have to insert it into there and bring the cable up through here. I should have done that before I tightened the clamps, but it's a little too late for that. So if you ever do this, make sure you put the oil injector cable into here, which I'm going to show you shortly how to do, and then bring it up here and tighten it in place before you put the clamps on. There's a hole in there that I need to go through. So there's a nut down the bottom here that needs to be tightened, and I will probably need some adjustment later. So we're going to put the air filter housing in. one of the first things you want to do is to try and get the boots of this. So you want to hook up these 3 boots to the carburetors. That might be a little challenging. And then make sure the clamps are accessible for tightening. So the key part of putting the boots on the carburetor throats is you want to make sure the boot is, you wrap it around the bottom of the carburetor throat. You can see that, how it's wrapped around before you tighten it. If you don't do that, you're not going to have air coming in through this air box. It's going to be coming in through a leakage point. So you have to be very careful. It takes some time to do this. It took me a few tries to get this on, but I'm still going to have to push it closer to the carburetor. You can wiggle the carburetor a little bit to get it to fit. Make sure you can see the bottom of this within the boot on all three of these openings. If you can't see it, you need to make sure it comes through. If it doesn't come through, you're going to have an air leak before you tighten the clamps. So I need to put this panel, this electrical panel back on. Put the baffle in place. And then this goes on top here. So one thing I might have to do is loosen this up again. I think I need to leave this loose. There we go. So there's 2 bolts that go in there. So what I had to do to find these holes is I had to remove a screw here so I could lift this up. I'm going to put that screw back in. It's a screw right on here, so I'm going to put that screw back in, tighten it up. Make sure before you tighten this that all the holes that you need to mount onto are lined up. If it's not lined up, you'll have to loosen this up again. So on the airbox, I did tighten all the screws that need to go on the airbox. Next thing you need to do is to put the ignition coils for the spark plugs in place. One of the things I do is you have to mount the ignition coils right in these 3 locations. There's some hooks here where you put the wiring harness pieces. So I'm going to start with the 3rd ignition coil, which is connected to this spark plug, and mount that. And I'm going to put it right up here. I'm going to loosen this. Put this in place. I would not tighten this right now because you have to connect some of these other cables too. So I'm going to put the 2nd one up. Now I'm going to turn this so this does not touch these cables, but at the same time you don't want these other smaller cables to rub against anything, so this is how I'm going to position this. And last but not least, I put this one in place. And you don't tighten it totally right now because you need to route some of these cables to make sure that they're routed correctly. What I'm going to do is I'm probably going to scan this in. This is how you should actually position the wires between the ignition coils. And if you follow the schematic, this is only for the VMAX, 1997 VMAX SX700. There may be other Yamahas that use the same type of sketch, but as long as you hook it up this way, you should be good to go. If you don't hook it up this way, you will have a lot of trouble starting the snowmobile, but I would recommend that you make a copy of this, take a snapshot, and follow this schematic. It's also in your schematic diagram, but for me it's easier just to sketch it this way to see which wire goes to which other wire on the ignition coils and the harness. So I did connect all the ignition coil wires as I showed in that schematic, and the last but not least, you need to put the air filter housing back on. And for that you actually slide it over this and just push it in place. So we also need to make an adjustment to the oil cable, which is this one here. It was kind of hard to find initially because the cover was on it. It's completely covered and I pulled it apart. See that? Based on the manual here, it says the spacing in here, when it's pulled apart, should be about 0.87 to 0.94 inch. Should be greater than 0.75, so this adjustment is still good. You have to push the cover onto it. So that's what it should look like. If you need to make an adjustment, you just need to follow the manual for this one. So what I'm going to do for this one, I'm going to have to make an adjustment to the throttle. This has to be exactly right. Before it engages the throttle, there's a little bit of a gap that you see here. This little area in here, there's a gap. That gap needs to be between 1 and 2 millimeters. Right now it's more than it, so I need to adjust it so it's actually tighter. And I'm going to adjust it on the throttle cable by twisting the throttle cable back and forth. So this is what I have to adjust the nut and twisting this in or out to get that between 1 to 2 millimeter adjustment. And I'll have to loosen this nut and turn this in or out. So again, you need a 10 millimeter crescent wrench, and I'm going to loosen this and see if tightening it is going to make a difference. Okay, I might have to loosen this up a little bit. You have to turn it in or out till you get the adjustment right. So the last thing I'm going to show is the choke adjustment. The choke is right here. This is the release position when you pull it up. You see that? Me pulling it up. And the fully engaged position is down here. Now I'm going to show you what moves on the carburetor. So I'm going to show you what you want to look right there, okay? I'm pointing my fingers right there. That's where you want to look. So when I engage the choke, you will see movement in that region. See? Back and forth. So you want to adjust it such that when you release it or put it in the closed position, now this is the open position, and when you close the choke, you want to make sure it's completely released. Unfortunately, my manual does not, the owner's manual does not give the adjustment on that, but you just want to make sure it's fully released when you release it. This is the closed position for the choke, and this is the open position. When you close the choke, the butterfly valves actually close on the carburetor. So you want to make sure when it's open, when it's fully open, this adjustment is such that this lever is completely released, or if you have any extra fuel coming to the engine, it's going to stall on you, it's not going to idle.